Well, it is true that we took a little while to do that, but that's okay. I'm glad that Brother Donnie and Liz are sitting by each other this morning, because Donnie sat by himself this morning up there. I didn't see Liz sitting up there by. All right. I'm not saying they were fighting or anything. I'm just saying that I'm glad that they were there. There you go. That's all right. As long as it's not a change of zip code, right? They'll be okay. That's fine. That's fine. We're going to continue tonight in Hebrews. We're going to actually specifically look at 4 verses tonight. We kind of had it kind of a little overlap, just a preview of them, if you will, last week. But I want us to begin in Hebrews chapter 5. We're going to look at verse 1 and then verses 4, 5, and 6. So I guess there's 4 verses there. But listen to what it says. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. Now, if you go down to verse 4, listen to what it says here. Again, it says, no man takes this honor to himself, but he who was called by God, just as Aaron was. So also God did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. As he also says in another place, you are a priest forever after, according to the order of Melchizedek. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, I had somebody ask me this question. They said, how did so-and-so become the pastor of our church? I said, well, the church voted him in. Oh. You see, a pastor doesn't become a pastor of a church by showing up, saying, I'm going to be the pastor this week. Am I right? It doesn't work that way, right? Well, the same thing here we find with the high priest. A man doesn't decide one day, I'm going to be the high priest. I'm going to be the high priest because I want to be the high priest. So here we see this taking place, that you just as a pastor cannot appoint himself to be the pastor, no man is capable of appointing himself and becoming a priest, let alone, remember we talked about last week, the high priest, who is Jesus Christ. So that just is not just going to happen. It's interesting because if you're not, I remember, I can remember before I ever preached my first sermon, thinking, well, that can't be that difficult. Or maybe, I can remember, well, I don't understand, Brother John, why don't we do all verses of that hymn that we have in the hymn? No, there's 5 of them, for crying out loud. Why don't we do all 5? For the longest time, I thought, well, why don't we do those things? Until you get what? In that position of why we do things the way that we do. Am I right? That's what happens. And so as I was thinking about this passage here, in the Old Testament, if you've ever really thought a whole bunch about the first king of Israel was who? Saul, right? And then shortly after Saul was who? Come on, David. And then right after David was who? And right after Solomon was who? There, Donnie got it right. Okay, that's pretty good. I'm going to stop there. Okay, that's pretty good. All right, that's very good. Because after Solomon, the reason there was 2 kings is because they divided, right? Judah and Israel, northern kingdom and southern kingdom. And so one of the kings along the way, his name was Saul. And the Bible tells us that Saul was a very intimidating figure, a very tall man. He was a man who more than once was told by God to do something, and sometimes he did it, sometimes he did not. God told him to destroy everything in one battle, and what happens? Anybody remember? Saul come out, and God says, what's that noise that I'm hearing? And Saul's like, God, I got you covered. All right, God, I've got these animals so that we can sacrifice them to you. And what does God say? Does anybody remember? God said, that's not what I told you to do, right? So Saul, also at times, and in fact, we won't go there if you want to look it up, in 1 Samuel chapter 13, the whole chapter. In that chapter, what you will find is Saul enters putting himself into the position of being a priest. Okay? Well, guess what he was not? A priest. Guess what he was not capable of doing? Inserting himself into that position. Okay? So in chapter 13 of 1 Samuel, what you'll find is you will find him trying to invade the priesthood. And because he tried to become a priest, ultimately he lost everything. Okay, ultimately he lost everything because he was trying to insert himself into something where it didn't belong. In fact, I think we use the phrase, say, mind your own business. Okay, He wasn't minding his own business. He was trying to do something that he was not, first of all, called by God to do, because he was not of that group. In fact, he was of the tribe of Benjamin, so he was of the smallest group that was there. So many times it happened. Also, too, there's a guy by the name of Korah. Korah and his followers, they tried to make themselves into priests. And guess what happened to them? The same thing that happened to Saul, okay? Ultimately losing their lives. And find ways that, in fact, if you that's in Numbers chapter 16, that you can find that activity taking place. And then also, too, you will find a king who did something. In fact, we're going to look this one up. If you would go back to the Old Testament, to 2 Chronicles, if you would please. 2 Chronicles chapter 26. All right, and we're going to find, and we're going to read about a king by the name of Uzziah. Okay, and he's in chapter 26, starting in verse 16, and we will go down to verse 21. Listen to what happens here. Okay, my Bible entitles these verses "The Penalty for His Pride," for Uzziah's pride. Okay, listen to what it says. But when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. For he transgressed against the Lord his God by entering the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. So Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him were 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men, and they withstood King Uzziah and said to him, "It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed. You shall have no honor from the Lord your God." Then Uzziah became furious and had a censer in his hand and to burn incense. And while he was angry with the priests, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priest in the house of the Lord, besides the incense altar. And Uzziah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and there on his forehead was leprous, so that they thrust him out of the palace. Indeed, he had also hurried to get out, because the Lord had struck him. King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. He dwelt in the isolated house because of his leper, but he was a leper, for he was cut off from the house of the Lord. Then Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. So what happened? Here was another person tried to insert himself into a position that was not his to do. Okay, and we will find that when we do that, disaster always follows. When it comes to serving God, I promise you this, God has given all of us special abilities to be used by Him, that we're supposed to use to bring glory to Him, to serve one another. And here we see a king. Remember, what was the king's job? It had nothing to do with going into the temple, had nothing to do with offering anything to God, but yet here he was. And if you notice there, the first part of that, when we read that, it says, but when he was strong in his heart, when he was filled with what? Pride. When he was filled with pride, he was lifted up. And listen to what it says, that because of his pride, destruction followed. Okay? Now, not only did he have leprosy fall upon his forehead, he also made the temple, everything else around him, unclean. Okay? So there was multiple problems that he created simply because he wanted to thrust himself into a position where he did not belong. Now remember, it's easy to say, I could do that job. I could do that. Until we do what? Try it for the first time or the second time. You see, it's not easy to be a priest in the Old Testament. In fact, you weren't allowed to be a priest unless you were of the lineage in the house of the priest. You weren't allowed to. And then when you were finally allowed to do the priestly duties, we found, especially in the New Testament, you've got to do it once in your lifetime. Okay? So here we see him. We see someone putting themselves into position by which they were not supposed to be. But also, too, we also find this, that Aaron, does anybody hear of the guy by the name of Aaron? Okay, Aaron was approved by God to be in the position of serving as priest. This is what he did. In fact, he was ordained to do so. In other words, set aside for that service. He was set aside to serve God, and that you can read again. That's in Exodus chapter 28, okay? So you can see where he has had all of these things, that he was chosen by God. He was chosen from men to minister to God. See, one of the things I believe is that when Brother Donnie, when Brother Bob, when Brother Carlos, and Brother Terry were all chosen as deacons at one point, Terry, our latest one, that it wasn't man who called for that position. It was God who ordained, set apart, and then we, by the power given to us by God, agreed with, and we officially put into that position the steps in ordaining as they did with Aaron. See, we need to remember that we do not get to choose that I'm going to be the high priest. We do not get to choose that I'm going to be the pastor. We do not get to choose that I'm going to be the music minister. We don't get to choose I'm going to be the deacon. That's what God chooses for us. Okay? So the high priest, again, is not chosen by man. It was ultimately chosen by God. Now, one of the things that Aaron was to do, Aaron's job was to make sure the sacrifices were taken care of. Made sure that the people, when they brought their offerings, were there. Made sure that everything was that was put out there. In fact, if you would, go back to Hebrews for just a moment. Hebrews, we're going to get out of our chapter 5. We're going to go back to chapter 8 for just a moment. And I want you to see in chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. Listen to what it says was the high priest's job, okay? Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Therefore, it is necessary that this one also have something to offer. Then if we go down, then we go to verse 4. For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law. And then we go on down to verse 9, and chapter 9, verse 14, and listen to what it tells us here about this position as well. He says to us this, very simply, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. So we can see here that the priesthood, if you remember the high priesthood, the priesthood that is there, the great high priest that we talked about in chapter 4, that this is who Jesus Christ is. Jesus Christ didn't just say one day, I'm going to go down, I'm going to be the high priest. I'm going to be the great high priest. He didn't say that. That was appointed to him, given to him by his Father. So we need to remember that the very existence of this position, the very existence of the priesthood, it was there so that those people could come to offer the sacrifices on behalf of man before God to make that relationship right with God. Isn't it interesting how sometimes we think we're cleaner before God than what we are? And you guys remember the story of of the Ark of the Covenant? And you remember, no one was allowed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. They had to use poles, right? And they had to use these poles. Do you remember they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant? Remember what happened? It started to fall. And somebody touched the Ark of the Covenant where they weren't supposed to. And they weren't allowed to do so. And they died. And you want to know, some people say, well, that's not fair. He was just trying to stop the Ark of the Covenant from hitting the ground. No, he thought his sin was above anything else. And it was okay for him to touch something so holy that God said, don't touch. Okay? You see, God could take care of the ark touching the ground. Okay? The high priest came on our behalf, the children of Israel's behalf, because that's how God made it work. That's why God put in a system. That is why the children of Israel, you had the Levites, you had the priests, you had all of these people, because God put them in place. God set them aside. God set aside the whole tribe of Levi, the whole tribe, to do the service in the temple. And so now we find in the New Testament, and here today, do we offer sacrifices like they did in the Old Testament? No. Why not? Because the Levitical priesthood, if you will, it was taken over by who? Jesus Christ as the great who? High priest. The one who comes on our behalf, who comes to make sure that we are taken care of. But we use a word called grace. Okay? His grace came down for us. His grace is what we needed to have. And that's exactly what it is. And it's fulfilled through Jesus Christ. And we need to remember just those things. Now, we need to remember in chapter 5, verse 1. It says here that for every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God. So they are set aside or ordained, the high priest, as for service to God. Jesus Christ was set aside for service to God. Remember the whole miracle of Christmas, we just celebrated this. And he was set aside because the job that he had as the great high priest, that he ultimately was the one who was offered as a sacrifice. It was interesting today, or maybe it was last night, I can't remember, it might have been this morning. One of the boys said something to the effect of, I wonder what Jesus looked like. Right? What does the Bible say a sacrifice had to be? Does anybody know? That it had to be perfect, right? Without blemish whatsoever. So, was Jesus perfect without blemish? Absolutely. And we thought about that. So that means, did he ever get hurt, break a bone? No, he never did. Never did. Why? Because then he could not be the perfect sacrifice without what? Blemish. Now, I didn't say he didn't have struggles. I didn't say that his brother, that growing up, that he had an easy life. But he could not be a blemished sacrifice for mankind. He could not be. So here we see him as the great high priest. And this is something that's important. And I highlighted this one on my paper in green. Okay? We need to remember that in verses 5 and 6 of reminding us that God is the one who appointed his Son for you and for me for that great high priesthood. He says, you are my son in verse 5. You are my son. Today I have begotten you, because we need that high priest. He says in verse 6, and he also says in other place, you are the priest forever. And is not Jesus Christ the ultimate sacrifice forever? Absolutely he is. So here we see this taking place. Here we see this offering that is there. Here we see the priesthood of Jesus Christ in verse 5 of chapter 5 Hebrews. Here we see what is clearly given to us that this is who you are. You are the high priest, the one who ultimately not offering sacrifices of animals on the altar, but who? Himself. That this is who you became. You became the great high priest for those around us. So what's the significance here? Here we see in verse 5 and 6, here we see these quotes. Here we see Melchizedek. We see according to the order of him. Here we see this. We have all these different things here. And it's interesting here because he also says this, today I have begotten you. All right? So let's talk a little bit about that phrase that today I have begotten you. In order to get some of the answers of what exactly does that mean, let's go back to the book of Acts for just a moment. Let's go back to Acts chapter 13, and let's see what Luke has to say to us about this topic. Again, Acts chapter 13, verses 33 and 34. And here's what it says. He says this, God has fulfilled this for us, their children, in that he raised up Jesus, as is also written in the Psalms, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. And then he raised him from the dead, no more to return to corruption. He has spoken thus, I will give you the sure mercies of David. You see, we see here that as this taking place, that he is the one. He is the one that was ultimately resurrected from the dead. He was the one ultimately the sacrifice for you and for me. This is what he's talking about here. He's not specifically talking about with these words about Christmas. What he's saying here is that Jesus was the offering that we had to have in our life. And that's what we need to remember. That we needed to remember that even though Aaron was a priest, Aaron could not have died on the cross for our sins. He wasn't the great and who? High priest. He was a priest, the first priest, right? But he could offer animal sacrifices. He could offer various offerings that were there because he was ordained to do so, set apart. Remember, because Saul got himself into trouble. Uzziah got himself into trouble, inserting themselves into positions and places where they were not called by God to do. And so here we see this reminding us that he was ordained to do these things. But he says, thou art my son. In Psalm 2, verse 7 is what he also says. He says, you are my son, Jesus. You are the offering that is going to be there. And it tells us this in verse 6 of Hebrews chapter 5, reminding us, he says, that thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So as we look at this and try to see what's taking place here, is that we need to remember here is that, does anybody remember some guy by the name of Abraham? Was there a guy by the name of Abraham in the Bible? Was he an important figure? Carlos, was he an important figure? Okay. Does anybody remember who Abraham gave a tithe to? Melchizedek. Okay? So here we see this name pop up again here in the New Testament, here in Hebrews. Here we see this, that it's taking place. And what he's really getting us to understand here is the final victory that he's going to have. This victory over the enemies. This victory that we need. That priest, that way back when. And some are going to say that was the incarnate of Jesus and so forth. I'm here to tell you tonight that the order that we have, that high priest, that's who we need on our behalf, that Jesus Christ became. Just like Melchizedek was there at the very beginning. We saw way back with Abraham. We see this happening. We'll talk about that in just a little bit more in just a second about what his name meant. Okay? But here we're going to see this over and over again that Aaron was ordained by God. He was there, but he was not to be the ultimate priest that would give himself up for you and for me. So let's talk about, since we've had all these priests. Okay, the Catholic Church has priests and others have priests, right? But priests during this time when we're reading, their job was not what we have today. Okay, their job was to offer up sacrifices in the Old Testament, New Testament until Jesus Christ came, and if they believed in who He was, that offering would have stopped. So here we see this taking place. So we need to understand something about this whole idea of why is Christ greater than the priest? Why is Christ greater than Melchizedek? Why is Christ better than any of these people, okay, that we see out there? First and foremost, we need to remember something about this. The first thing is that His ordination is greater because He is the high priest forever. Okay? In the New Testament and throughout the Bible, what you will find is these priests would go in and they didn't get to stay the high priest forever. He appointed to him once. And that's what happened. They appointed for them to be able to have that take place, and that they didn't get to do so. So when the priest died, he had to automatically would relinquish that job description for him to pass on to someone else, or when they would relinquish that office. So we need to remember that this is the whole idea of this high priest. Here in Hebrews, we find it 6 different times. So it's an important thing to remember who Jesus Christ is. Because remember, people want to try to water down who Jesus Christ is. You know, He is the ultimate sacrifice for us. He is the one that we can trust. He is that one. And this is what Hebrews is getting at here. And we need to remember this. So an understanding of who He is, that He is the priest forever, which means He is the one who gives us salvation forever. Since Jesus Christ is forever, salvation is forever. This is why it's a gift that is forever, over and over again. And that's why we need to remember those things. Now, let's see something else about this ordination of Jesus, if you will. Remember, it tells us there, he says, right there for us in verse 1, appointed in the things pertaining to God, set aside for the things of God, ordained for the service of God, that they were, again, his ordination was unique and different because he is the Son of God. And Aaron was not that Son of God. So let's talk a little bit here about Melchizedek here. And we need to see kind of get a little bit of an understanding here of who he was and why this name appears right here. First and foremost, the name Melchizedek only appears 2 times in the entire Old Testament. Okay? It appears in the book of Genesis, and it also appears in Psalm 110. Okay? So it appears 2 different times. His name means King of Righteousness. All right? And it is also known as the King of Salem, which means the King of Peace. Okay? So here we have these different names. But it's very, very interesting here is that Melchizedek is that he was both a priest and a king. Okay? Did you catch that? He was the king. He was King of Salem, Melchizedek, King of Peace. So he was this king, and he was also this priest that is there. And guess what? Uzziah wanted to be that, didn't he? He wanted to be the priest and he wanted to be the king. Now, it's interesting when you read the Old Testament because there's times you have sprinklings of when the Holy Spirit works in people's lives. And you find that. They don't use the phrase in there. You also find here with Melchizedek, who was the only person who could be Melchizedek? Who was the only one who could be man and priest? Jesus Christ. Okay, this incarnate, if you will, here, he's the only one. And in the law, these two things, offices, if you will, of the high priest and the king were put together. And so Jesus Christ became the high priest. He became the king forever. And where does he reign today? On the throne in heaven. Okay, that's where he's at today. So Jesus Christ fulfilled all the Old Testament prophecies. People say, well, how in the world can the Old Testament and the New Testament, how do we know all those things were written at the same time? Because we know when the Old Testament was written. And we know for a fact that everything written in the Old Testament came true about Jesus Christ. Am I right? That's what happened. It is going to happen. The only prophecy that we're still waiting to be fulfilled is what? The return of Jesus Christ. I mean, there's other things that, you know, that we sure need to have some answers to. But when Jesus Christ returns, then that prophecy, that fulfillment of that prophecy will take place. So Jesus Christ, since he is that king, he is the high priest. He is the one who is the great high priest. He is the one that is sitting on his throne. He is then, because of those reasons, he can have this position because it is going to last forever. Okay, what a day it's going to be when we get to see Jesus and all of these different questions that we can have and understand. It also tells us this. If you would go to Hebrews chapter 7. Okay, listen to what it says. It says, For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first but being translated King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, meaning King of Peace. So here we see this king, and if you notice here too, it says here, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. What does the phrase made a priest continually mean? Forever. Okay, it's still taking place. So who fulfilled? Who is the one that is the priest forever? Jesus Christ. The high priest, the only high priest that is there. And we need to remember that Jesus Christ is the one that we can trust, the high priest, continually. So I want to close with just a little bit more about Melchizedek here. I want us to see how relating this to Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ was the one who Melchizedek, again, pictures of who he is, a heavenly high priest. So see, we don't need a high priest any longer on this earth, do we? No, we don't. We don't have to, because Jesus Christ is the high priest. He is the one who is sitting right now at the feet, in the throne of heaven right now. Jesus Christ, okay, could have never served as high priest when he was on this earth. Okay? He couldn't have served it as a high priest when he was on this earth, because he didn't belong to the tribe of, anybody know? Levi. Okay? And only of the tribe of Levi could you be a high priest. Jesus Christ came from what tribe? Judah. Right? Right? So here we know, but where is he at now? In heaven, the high priest, the great high priest for you and for me, because that is exactly where he's supposed to be. He became that sacrifice on this earth that he could not, that no one else could fulfill. He was that gift for you and for me, and we should be thankful for this. So he became the high priest, not on this earth, but the high priest in heaven. That's where he came from. And we need to remember, we'll kind of delve into that in chapters 7 through 10 of Hebrews, which is going to talk more about this topic. But as we look at and we understand here that Jesus Christ is the great and high priest for us. And he died for us. But more importantly, we always like to focus on that he died for us, but he also lives for us. And because he is the great high priest, we can have forgiveness. And that's what we need to have. That's what we need to be reminded of today, because Jesus Christ lives for us. Brother Donnie, would you come, please?